Hello everybody, welcome back to Start McClary. I'm Sean, and today we are going to study all the generations of cars. We're going to talk about the details of them, talk about what's in them, talk about the difference between other generations, talk about the pros of them, talk about the cons, and all that good stuff. So, why don't we get started? We are going to start out with the Generation 1 car. The Generation 1 car was introduced in 1948, the same year that NASCAR was introduced. What the Gen 1 car had was basically a strictly stock frame and body. The doors were strapped or bolted shut. It had heavy-duty rear axles to prevent the cars from flipping. And from 1948 to 1951, most of the cars were pre-World War II due to the post-WW2 shortage. Through the rest of the 1950s, the Hudson Car Company was the first car manufacturer to support NASCAR racing teams. And up until 1962, convertible cars were allowed in the race. The Gen 1 is what people considered the race on Sunday, sell on Monday kind of car. The Gen 1 car was around until 1966. It was the only generation to not have any aerodynamics whatsoever. It's basically what is known as the true stock car, with everything stock on it. So that's all I have to say about Generation 1. Why don't we go on to Generation 2? Generation 2 was introduced in 1967. It basically is mostly known as the 70s cars. It basically had a stock body, but it had a modified frame. It had a modified chassis, and that became part of the sport. It was the first car where aerodynamics came into play in 1970 with the wing at that time. Up until 1971, it was the last generation of cars that did not have a window net. And it was the last real car instead of built race cars. It was the last known generation where you race on Sunday, sell on Monday kind of deal. Basically, all I could say about Generation 2 is that it was basically the best car that Richard Petty had in his career. And basically, it was almost the same as Generation 1, except it had a modified frame and a modified chassis. And also, there were some other changes where actually it became more built race cars when NASCAR came into the modern era in 1972. So that's all I have to say about Generation 2 cars. It was around until 1980. So why don't we go on to Generation 3? Generation 3 cars was introduced in 1981. It basically is known as the 80s cars. The wheelbase were reduced to 110 inches, and it was also downsized to better resemble the cars from a showroom floor. But however, body panels were still purchased through the manufacturers. It was the last car to show a stock body. And also, unlike the previous two generations, the cars had more speed. It was the last generation of cars to have unrestricted safety. Because back then, safety, there was no roof flaps, there was no full-faced helmets, there was no Hans device. There was nothing like that. It was just basically the last year with unrestricted safety. Now, you can wear a full-face helmet, and it's your choice if you want to wear a full face or open face. But most people at that time still were open-faced. But, like I said, this was the last generation that showed stock car. So, that's all. And Gen 3 car was around until 1991. So, without further ado, let's move on to the big generation that we all know, the Generation 4 cars. The Gen 4 car was introduced in 1992. It was basically known as the modern car, which had a highly modified body and actually had the most aerodynamics than any of the previous generations, as teams spent hours and hours in a wind tunnel to figure out the best aerodynamics, especially in the 2000s. The bumpers, nose, and tails composed of molded fiberglass based off production counterparts. It had the great thing is about the Gen 4 car, it had the best racing than any other generation of cars. But until the end of 2002, it was the last generation of cars that have a non-common body template. And then in 2003, it used the same template for all cars. It was the first car to go through many safety changes, especially since the death of Dale Sr. in 2001. The Gen 4 car basically had the best aerodynamics than any other generation, and plus, in my opinion, it provided the best racing than any other generation. Than in my opinion, at least. But the downside of the Gen 4 car is that like I said before, it wasn't as safe, especially in the 90s. Like, it was more dangerous, it seems like, because people got through more injuries with the Gen 4 cars than the previous generations. But they went through a lot of changes in the 2000s to make the car safer. So that's all I have to say about the Gen 4 car. It was around full-time until 2006, and it fully ended part-time in 2007. So that's all. So without further ado, let's go on to the Gen 5 car. The Gen 5 car, also known as the car of tomorrow, was introduced in 2007. Basically what it is, it introduced a new era of safety. It had a common body and common chassis for all manufacturers. It introduced a front splitter and a rear wing to adjust aero options. And it also introduced side force and more aero dependence instead of speed dependence that the previous Gen cars had. It had the rear wing until 2010, and then it went back to the spoiler. Now, there's a lot of... Now, the pros of the car tomorrow is that, like I said, it was safer, and it was more cost efficient. But there's a bunch of downsides with the car tomorrow, especially with the earlier models. It did not look as cool. It did not provide as good of racing as the Gen 4 car did. There was also a lot of problems with the splitter and side force. And the cars were hard to adjust to the other drivers. However, it did improve in the last couple years. They made it better. But basically, it just didn't fit as well as the Gen 4 car did. So the car tomorrow was not a bad car. It just had a lot of problems with it. I think it would have been better. And that's all I have to say about the car tomorrow. It was around until 2012. So that's all I basically have to say about the COT. So let's go on to the current generation, which is Generation 6. The Generation 6 car was introduced in 2013. Basically what it is, it was a manufacturer unique body panels placed on the existing chassis, and also with an enhanced body design. They basically claimed it was supposed to put the stock back in stock car, which was false. Up until the end of 2014, it was the last generation to have an unrestricted engine. And then in 2015, it was the first generation of cars that had restricted power in all tracks with the tapered spacer. It basically had the most aero changes than any other generation of cars. Unfortunately, this is the downside. It had a strong negative reaction from both the fans and the competitors, especially in the last few years. One of the main reasons why a lot of the NASCAR stars retired, in my opinion. But the pros of the Gen 6 car, it did, at least until the end of 2014, we did have some great racing, and we did have some history made with the car. But of course, the downside was they made so many changes into the car that it often confused the other competitors, and the aerodynamics we had was the worst. And it provided worse and worse racing every year. So that's what all I could think about the Gen 6 car. It's still around today. I don't know how long it's going to be around, but that's all I have to say about the Gen 6 car, and I think that's all the other generation of cars. So why don't we get to the next part, which is the conclusion. In conclusion, all the generations of cars had their unique thing they had. They had what was either style, speed, or aerodynamics, or whatever. They all had their unique thing. Now, the downside of the Gen 1 and the Gen 2 cars is that basically it's basically their own cars that they turn into a race car. So there's another driver that can have a heavy advantage over the other competitor, easily. I mean, it's basically it was not as restricted back then because Gen 1 cars was the only generation to not have any aero. So I have to say, the problem is with the earlier generations that it can be easily manipulated, especially since we didn't have the technology back then. So that's the downside of the earlier generations. But other than that, the Gen 1 through the Gen 3 all provided great racing in a lot of ways, and especially the Gen 4 car. They were all doing good, and it was basically good how they progressed into the modern technology. However, it just all went downhill ever since the COT got introduced. Basically, ever since then, NASCAR went so heavy on safety, and they always keep making constant changes to the cars. Try to make it the best way they can. And unfortunately, it's just getting worse year after year, especially with the Gen 6 car. So that's all I have to say about this, guys. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, that's okay. But anyways, I'm Start McCleary. Thanks for watching. Peace.